Hi, this is Barry Fitzgerald from Ghost Hunters International, and you're listening to Unknown Origins Radio.
We live in a world filled with the unknown. Ghosts and spirits wander through our physical dimension. Undiscovered creatures lurk in the shadows, and strange lights and craft seem to dominate our skies. Modern science refuses to acknowledge their existence, yet credible eyewitnesses are convinced these things are real, and it's up to independent researchers to search for the truth. Welcome to Unknown Origins Radio.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Unknown Origins Radio, where we talk about everything having to do with the strange and paranormal. I'm Mark Johnson, and joining us as usual are Karrie-Ann Versace. Hey, Karrie-Ann.
Hey, Mark.
And Loren. I'm good. And Loren DiPinto.
Hey, Mark. What's going on, Karrie-Ann?
I'm good.
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 We are good.
We are good.
Yeah. What about that earthquake that happened?
What earthquake?
In the Malaysia. What was it, an 8.7?
Yeah, I mean, they were concerned about another tsunami, Loren, wiping them out.
Are you kidding? I have to turn a TV on once in a while, I think.
Yeah, at least do it while you're curling your hair like I do.
Oh, God, curling my hair.
Yeah, sometimes turning on the TV is so depressing.
It is. The news is just always very depressing for me.
And 2012 is not gotten any better. It's getting worse, it seems.
Hey, stop that. We ended my two.
It's like, let's see, tornadoes and floods and earthquakes. It's like, really?
It's cataclysmic. It really is.
Oh, yeah, and then there's those strange sounds. You know, the ones that they keep. I guess there were more strange sounds recorded in, where was it, Minnesota or Wisconsin?
Really? Like those ones we were listening to that time?
Right.
Yeah. In fact,
sounds?
I downloaded a clip today of the sounds. Listen to this.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God. It's going to be something sad. But...
I am not amused. I get enough of this around my own house.
What's this sound going to happen?
All right, enough about that. We have a great guest tonight, so let's get right into it. He's coming to us all the way from Scotland. Our guest tonight is an author and investigative journalist, ranging from the world of politics to ancient history and the mysterious. He's lectured extensively and has appeared on a number of television programs and is one of the regular commentators on the wildly popular History Channel show Ancient Aliens, the series. He has a new book out, The Ancient Alien Question, which is now available everywhere. So please welcome Philip Coppens to the program. How are you tonight, Philip?
I'm doing great.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And I have to tell you, I'm geeking out a little bit tonight because, I do Ancient Aliens, the show, is one of my guilty pleasures. I really love that show. I mean, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I think sometimes it's stretching, trying to, milk out the whole ancient alien thing when some of the topics they cover. But for the most part, I think it brings up a lot of fascinating subjects that I've always been really into.
Well, and some of the things which they focus on, the themes they pick, like the undead from season 3, is also in an effort to get younger children, a young adult audience interested in these things. But yes, a few days ago, on Wednesday, I think, actually what hit me was that Katy Perry announced, I think while she was touring in New Zealand, that for Christmas she bought 50 DVDs of Ancient Aliens season 1 and gave it in a basket to all of her best friends, and that everybody on her tour is forced to watch Ancient Aliens all the time. So it definitely has an extremely wide audience, and at the end of season 2, it was known that at the end of each episode, about 100 million people watched each episode. So that's a big number worldwide, and it definitely shows that interest in this subject has gone mainstream.
That's incredible. See, I remember not only reading Eric von Daniken's original book, Chariots of the Gods, back when I was a kid, when he wrote that back in the 60s. And, then they made the documentary. And then when I was growing up in Los Angeles, there was a local station that twice a year, they always played that documentary. And I was glued to it every single time it aired because I just found it such an incredible concept. And now as an adult, and so much more information has been made available over the years. Many more researchers are taking von Daniken's original theories and running with it, expanding with it, and really finding some very strange, complex, interesting archaeological finds all over the world that seem to point out that, I'll be honest with you, the jury is out whether it's actual aliens, but it's something seems to have been interacting either with human society back then, or maybe we were more advanced than we knew back then. I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, I think it's all of those things. Aliens should not be used for explaining everything, and to some extent, they're not. And even Eric, when he created the Ancient Astronaut Society in the 1970s, his basic premise was that history was wrong, that history was far more complex and far richer than we were giving it credit for, and that our ancestors were either far more advanced than we were, and/or that there had been at some point an alien intervention. And I think it's an end universe. I think those two both have happened, and we are slowly beginning to see a bit more of the lay of the land, because despite the fact that archaeologists have done very little new research in the last few 40 years, there have been new developments, there have been new discoveries, in the sense that to some extent they have been forced to make new discoveries, and to another extent that some of them have been looking at satellite imagery and have been discovering new civilizations or new indications of lost civilizations. So we do live in times whereby we move closer to finding answers as to really what our history is all about, but it is very slow, and in my opinion too slow, pretty much because we are living in a world whereby we no longer trust financial institutions, we no longer trust politicians, but we still trust scientists. And I think definitely that blind belief or blind faith or blind trust in them is something which is going away slowly, but maybe not as fast as it should be. We should giving them blind trust and just checks, and telling them to get on with it without any oversight, and without them creating steps whereby we're actually unable to see what they're doing. That is not good for anything, and it should come to a stop soon.
I just finished reading your book, The Ancient Alien Question, and one of the topics that you bring up in relation to scientists and modern science, in fact, I hate to say it, science for the last 500 years since the Renaissance, is that while science has made great strides and leaps and bounds in so many different areas, they seem to struggle a lot with history and archaeology, because almost like a religious dogma, they have accepted one set of facts, and they tend to ridicule, laugh off, scorn, or otherwise completely ignore any other facts that come up that contradict the original tried and true theories of what, how the human race developed, and certain aspects of history.
Well, it's a game. And it's a very ridiculous game, and I'll give you two examples. One of them is that in the 1980s, the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid at Giza were carbon dated, and the carbon dating results show that both pyramids are roughly 800 years older than currently listed. They are built according to these carbon dating results in the 4th millennium BC, not in the 3rd millennium BC. Furthermore, that whereas traditionally we think that the Great Pyramid came first and then the Second Pyramid came later, actually the carbon dating results reversed that and actually said that it was the other way around. These carbon dating results have been uncontested. Nobody's saying that they are in some way erroneous. However, what has happened is that since the 1980s, these carbon dating results have not been published in any peer-reviewed journal. And the reason for that is because as a result of this, the Egyptologists and archaeologists can play this game whereby they can pretend that it doesn't exist, because guess what? It's not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So as far as we're aware, these things haven't happened. And that is just, a quite incredible scenario whereby they have created this game whereby they can get away with these things. Another scenario also from ancient Egypt is the following. This timeline which they are adhering to of dynasties is something which Manetho wrote down in early in the 3rd century BC. And he basically mapped all the dynasties of ancient Egypt, which went back to roughly 3000 BC. And he writes that before there was a rule of the demigods called the Shemsu Hor, or the follower of Horus, and that before that the gods ruled themselves. And this period of time stretched back to roughly 30,000 BC. Now, what is being done is that the Egyptologists and everybody else strictly adhere to Manetho's timeline from the first dynasty on, and basically almost treat as if it was infallible. And, it shouldn't be. There are minor problems there, left, right, and center, because guess what? Manetho wasn't infallible. He was just an ordinary human being, writing down a king's list. But when the attitude of the historians really comes to the forefront is when they are asked, well, okay, so one bit of this list you find is absolutely infallible, it's so correct. So what about the other bit, the one which says that the gods ruled over Egypt and that the history of ancient Egypt goes back to 30,000 BC? Their answer is, well, of course he invented that, because we all know that didn't exist. And if this was a court case, you couldn't do that. A piece of evidence needs to be taken as a whole. You can't just say, well, I like this piece of, I like the fact that the bullet came from this gun, but I don't like the fact that the bullet didn't hit that body. You can't do that. In a court case, you need to basically take the bullet or leave it out. Yet again, historians are able to play with games and kind of like ridicule one aspect of somebody's testimony, and then say that the other part of his testimony is completely above board, if not almost, divine in the way it should be adhered to. And it's simply, sad to see that this is the games science plays, because the end result is that we are deprived of our history. We are deprived of so many beautiful things, so many beautiful accomplishments of our ancestors. And I think that when we were or would be looking at those things and would be cherishing them, I actually think we would be, as a species, different, less alone, richer, aware that some of the things which we're trying to do have been done in the past, and we would be able to have more of a frame of reference rather than just seemingly drifting because we are pretending that we are for the first time at the summum of creation. And that's simply, a very egotistical way of looking at ourselves as a species.
Well, and I agree, and I know that we're dealing with a lot of, there's religious dogma or religious resistance to a lot of the theories about how far mankind goes back. I mean, heck, even here in America, we're having issues of teaching evolution versus creationism in the schools. There's still that constant battle between ideologies, but yet archaeologists are still unearthing items and artifacts that are showing strong evidence that mankind has existed and is in our form, in our intelligence, far longer than what we have always believed. What was it? I believe a week or two ago there was an article that came out where they showed that in an archaeological dig that mankind was using fire up to 1 million years ago. Now, I'm a layman, so I can't even tell you which form of mankind was existing back then. I don't know if it was Australopithecus or what version, but it was not modern man, at least according to modern science.
No, and I mean, we give so little credibility to our fellow species on this planet as well. There's a beautiful documentary I once saw about the dolphins and basically how they were being educated. And at one point, the dolphins behavior was simply weird, and they no longer understood what they were doing, and it was as if they all of a sudden had become stupid. And the scientists realized that the dolphins actually, after a while, the scientists realized that the dolphins had actually understood the sequence of kind of like numbers and everything else which they were being given, and they basically said like, okay, let's skip today's class, and this is the answer to the next lesson. And once the scientists realized that the dolphins had been doing this, they had a completely different approach to this species, and we know so very little of it. Just a few weeks ago, I was with somebody who was explaining to me that there are birds in the Andean highlands who use the sap of certain trees to actually soften rock to make nests, because they can only, basically the only place where they are safe to build nests is in rocks. And so somehow these birds found, either by accident or by whatever means, this juice which somehow makes rocks become softer. And well, guess what? We live in an environment there whereby we know that those people in those places did very weird things to rocks and built gigantic rock monuments with high precision. And you kind of like sort of wonder whether in origin this maybe have something to do with the fact that birds were doing these things and that we were looking at these birds. And all of those things, are relatively mundane. Our ancestors looking at nature, finding a bird who is able to soften rock, bringing this into the society and applying this to their building techniques is not something that's special. Yet not a single scientist is doing it. Instead, it is very much like the dogma that science, there's this great line from The Name of the Rose, the Umberto Eco book, and which basically says that, God's creation was not there to be explored, but that everything which was being discovered was just further evidence of the fact that God had created the universe. And that is very much the attitude of science right now. Even though they will tell you it's about exploration and all of these things, science as a whole is absolutely convinced that they are absolutely correct about the big questions of the universe, and that everything else what they're doing is basically filling in the gaps or kind of making further evidence for what they already know. And the worst offenders really are history. We get these headlines of like, oh, new civilization found, and what it really is like a scientist who tries to get a headline, but in origin none of these civilizations, which quite often are found by them, are either lost or are a real civilization. Quite often they are some kind of temple complex in the middle of nowhere which they have found, and as great as that is, it's not a civilization. True lost civilizations like Atlantis is something which they don't go into, because when you look at the likes of Ken Feder, he is happy to go on television and say that they absolutely know that there is no such thing as Atlantis. Well, if you were a true scientist, Mr. Feder, you would not say these kind of things, because you can never prove a negative. But even if you disregard that, it is just a fallacy to continuously see some of these same people make false statements, make erroneous statements, and all of this in a way which is very egotistical, because they somehow feel that they have to defend the position of science against stupidity. And it's a sad state of affairs, and it's specifically when it comes to history and archaeology, as you might have understood by now, it somewhat upsets me.
Yeah, I can feel your passion coming through, and I agree with you. I'm right there with you, because it's frustrating when you can see the evidence in front of you and then you hear the official denials that so many of the public are just so willing to believe. It's like, oh, the scientists say it couldn't happen, so that's it. Let's move on with life. But there's so much evidence, and one of the things that I think is really incredible about the Ancient Aliens series and all the books and everything that came out before that is that they're trying to bring into the mainstream the fact that there are these anomalies that contradict what we think we know about our history. Most recently, one of my favorite episodes of the Ancient Alien series so far was the whole episode dedicated to Puma Punka. And I've never visited South America. I would love to go one day because there's so many of these incredible sites. But Puma Punka and the information that was brought forth in the television show, those stone blocks and how precise they were cut, and you couldn't find any tool marks on them, at least tool marks that we understand, and yet they're cut with such precision, and it's just unexplainable. And modern science seems to just think, oh, well, they came in, they chiseled it, or they don't want to explain it at all.
Well, first of all, you should come on a tour I'm doing in October, which is exploring Puma Punka and various of the other sites in Peru. But yeah, I mean, Puma Punka is definitely when you were to get all the ancient alien theorists, around one table, they would probably agree that Puma Punka is the most anomalous, best evidence of something, of an ET visitation. And I think I was very happy with that episode, because they actually included something which it's a theory, and I have no evidence for it. But I'm very happy that they put it out there, because what we see in Puma Punka is we can't date it. It has been dated by circumstantial things which were found around it, and it really is dating Stonehenge by finding that there's a Mars bar wrapper around it, and it shows that it existed back then, but it doesn't really prove anything beyond that. And so what we have in Puma Punka is potentially something which is so old and of an other intelligence. And it's not just the archaeological evidence. The one thing which I think always needs to be underlined is that the Incas always said that Viracocha manifested himself around Lake Titicaca, that he manifested himself there, stayed there for a while, and then walked down the Sacred Valley. And it is, of course, in Cusco and Ollantaytambo that you see further evidence of his presence in these gigantic stone blocks with which these places have been built. But in Puma Punka, it seems like that was ground zero. And I think some of the other buildings around Puma Punka actually might have been built by later civilizations, simply because I think certain people came there to witness what Puma Punka was, almost like some kind of prehistoric or historic or Peruvian Inca equivalent to the pilgrimages which people make to Lourdes or Jerusalem. People came there because they wanted to experience this, and I think this somewhat explains as to why people have found Sumerian artifacts nearby there. Try to explain that one, how there were Sumerian artifacts. Also the fact that there are depictions of faces of various cultures from across the world, somehow suggesting that all of these cultures came there. And why would they have come there? And I think part of the answer might be that they came to see Puma Punka. Again, there is at this moment in time no evidence for this, but I think we might be close to a truth there. And it is a phenomenal site. There are stones there which on one side have a 6-sided opening, on the other side a 5 one, and you really wonder, even today, there is not a single thing in my house or in all the houses which I visited, including industrial places, where such a thing would be needed. Yet somehow somebody at a distant moment in time felt that there was a clear need for this in Puma Punka, and it really staggers belief as to why that would have been.
Philip, I want to ask, going back to those stones, they were perfectly shaped H's when you look at them. Like Mark was saying, there was such precision. Now, did you say they were not able to date them, or did they come to at least a close date?
Well, stone by default cannot be dated, so it always has to be circumstantial. And what they found was certain material which they could carbon date, which was found near those stones, and they gave a date of roughly 800 AD. Now, again, it is dating Stonehenge by the Mars bar wrapper, because it's not dating Stonehenge. You cannot date the stones of Stonehenge. It always has to be done circumstantially. Right. And in the case of Stonehenge, there is recent discoveries, basically actually saying that the dates of Stonehenge are out by 5,000 years, that parts of that complex have been built in 8,000 BC, and it's actually archaeological and haphazard archaeological excavation, which was happening when they were doing work to the car park, which basically began to validate the fact that the dating of Stonehenge is probably thousands of years off. And the same thing I think could definitely be said for places like Pumapunku, where the date of 800 AD just feels weird. It sits there as a glaring anomaly, kind of like, there is no explanation for it. Okay, we have dated it now ascribe it to a culture, ascribe a reason for it, and it doesn't work, because in my opinion the dating is wrong.
Right. How many stones exactly were there?
H ones, dozens.
Wow.
Some of them are actually one of the more interesting ones I find is where there's actually clear precision drilling in some of the grooves which have been made. So you have grooves which are very clear, but then there are literally what seems like somebody drilling in there, and those holes are extremely precise. But most interestingly, it's the spacing which is so precise, and then the depth to which they have been drilled, which is so precise, which clearly shows a technological capability. But then also you look at it and you kind of think like, what was the purpose again? Why was anybody doing this in our ancestral past? Because this is just weird as to why somebody would be doing it, and the way it was done, immediately suggests that there was some kind of technical or technological application for this. And so, even though we're still at a loss to identify what that was, it sits there and it is waiting for more attention from clever minds who can suss these things out. And again, that special on Pumapunku kind of like began to reveal that there are people out there who are looking into these things and coming up with ingenious ways of trying to explain what's there. At this moment in time, nothing decisive, but at least, it's being explored, and exploration can lead to discovery.
Yeah, I mean, just for our listeners, these H stones, if you haven't had a chance to see the episode, were absolutely perfect in diameter and everything. They're just perfect and very detailed.
Mm-hmm. And of a most unusual shape. And Pumapunku is like scattered. The stones just lie there as if a bulldozer ran through it. And that's, of course, one of the other question marks, which is, if it was indeed 8th century, what destroyed Pumapunku so much, yet didn't destroy the other buildings which were of the same age? And whereas again, the archaeologist will say, oh, well, there are a number of examples whereby our ancestors destroyed previous temple complexes. That is absolutely true, but then they should also add that when such destruction occur, basically the evidence is nicely destroyed, in the sense that it is buried and taken out of sight, and done like that. It is not just thrown about the way Pumapunku is.
Yeah.
Could it possibly be, has anyone ever looked into the correlation of maybe, I know that many cultures, including Judeo-Christian in the Bible, they talk about the flood of Noah. And, for the most part, when I hear that, I think, okay, it's another story that's told in the Bible. But yet, the flood story is not isolated with Judeo-Christian beliefs, because there has been a version of a flood story found in almost every great culture across the planet, which seems to indicate that quite possibly there was some type of anomalous event that happened several thousand years ago that caused a great catastrophe, whether we're looking at maybe an asteroid impact that caused great tsunamis, or weather patterns changed for a period of time. But could possibly, like a complex like Pumapunku, if stones are just set on each other with no mortar, if there's a great flood or some kind of natural energy that could cause the stones to be scattered, then when the waters recede, of course, then the stones are scattered. Nobody knows how they were made that way.
Well, it's a possibility, of course. Pumapunku sits on an extremely high ground. It's at 12,000 feet high. So, but there are massive earthquakes in that region. Peru, every hotel you will clearly see the signs of saying, if there is an earthquake, stay here. The buildings there are clearly designed to withstand them, so there is no real danger. But just imagine going back thousands of years. Imagine that building was there. Actually, I think what is a slightly more likely scenario is that building might have been tens of thousands of years old, and when the last ice age began, and all the a thing like just the weight of the ice on the tectonic plates must at some point have caused earthquakes to happen. It is just a tremendous amount of weight which gets shifted, and when we realize that just dams which are being built and artificial lakes in like Russia can cause earthquakes, then we know that the ice age must have come about with its kind of tectonic movement as well. And I think tectonic movement might have definitely done something to Pumapunku, and specifically continued tectonic movement over thousands of years. I also think deliberate destruction of Pumapunku by whoever built it might be another possibility, or that whatever Pumapunku was at some point actually exploded, that it simply couldn't maintain what it was doing and kind of like blew apart. All of those things are, of course, scenarios which we will only ever begin to find an answer to once we kind of like figure out what it was all about.
Now, I haven't had a lot of opportunity to travel, but one of the locations that I was lucky enough to visit a few years ago was down in Mexico, and and I visited Chichen Itza and the Tulum sites. And Chichen Itza is one of those iconic locations with the Great Pyramid there and the other complexes, and I got to go back when you could still climb on the pyramid. Now they don't let anybody climb, and which I don't blame it, because man, that thing is steep. I was afraid of taking one step off and I'd be tumbling all the way down. But the one thing that always just struck me, and again, I'm a layman, I'm not a historian, so you can correct me, but I always felt that everybody always attributes the Mayans to being such a bloodthirsty culture, and they didn't have the wheel, and they seemed like a tribe or like a peoples that was living very primitively, yet they were able to supposedly build these gigantic structures. And whether it's the concept of what was the god? Quetzalcoatl coming down and teaching them, the god Quetzalcoatl, who came down and taught them all these different things and helped teach them to build, or maybe another civilization. It seems that the Mayan culture, it almost seems like the Mayan culture as we know it, I don't feel could have built these structures, or they were a different people, and then over time they devolved back to a more primitive society. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the Mayans were not bloodthirsty. It's like the Aztec period at the very end of that empire that they really start sacrificing pretty much everybody, and to some extent, I think they were panicking. They were trying to do these things. It would be like the equivalent of what Hitler did for various other nefarious reasons. They are doing because somehow they realize that they're in trouble and they need to please the gods, and mass extinction by sacrifice is basically their way of going about it. But that is like reducing European history to a few years of what happened in Germany in the Second World War. At the same time, there is such things as Versace, and there is good things about European history as well. And so, I think we give the Mayans, when you go back to the early 90s, the Mayan civilization was hardly discussed. It was hardly visited, and now it was hardly understood. And now we're beginning to realize certain things. And I love Chichen Itza because the late and great Dr. Linda Sheely was a remarkable woman who realized that what was there at Chichen Itza was basically a three-dimensional rendering of the creation mythology, and just the walking through Chichen Itza is amazing. Chichen Itza was also one of the preferred locations throughout the Baktum ending ceremonies of the Mayans, where the gods were said to appear and speak to mankind, which is the entire 2012 phenomenon. So I think we're giving slowly more credibility to the Mayans, and I also think that we quite often need to let go of certain things. Like, historians are very big into kind of like saying, well, this was a primitive culture because they didn't have writing. Oh, look, this is a primitive culture because they didn't have the wheel. So what? It's kind of like, the wheel isn't that great. The wheel is basically something which works in certain environments, but we've all been around with our suitcases in places where we are pulling it, and we're kind of like thinking, seriously, this wheel isn't ideal for the surface we're on, and that is quite often a big determining factor, that some of the surfaces on which civilizations like the Mayans and the Inca were building, the wheel was simply not a great tool for that. And most specifically, we are approaching it from our perspective. The Mayan civilization was somebody who I think built, but also built in liaison with the gods, for the gods. They had this very symbiotic relationship, which typifies an awful lot of ancient civilizations. The ancient Egyptian one is another one. And so my perspective is that yes, they built it, but also that they didn't walk this path of civilization alone. This is my overall conclusion, in the ancient alien question, which is that all known civilizations, or at least the very big ones, the Incas, the Mayans, the Egyptian one, the Sumerian one, they all said that the path of civilization was not walked by them alone, but it was walked hand in hand with the gods, who sometimes were physically present there and were always there to help them out if for some reason they were stuck on this path of civilization. And that is something which, we need to underline. The ancient alien people quite often get from academics skeptical remarks of saying, oh, well, what you do is some kind of post-colonial attitude by proclaiming that the Native Americans, the people of Egypt, and all of these people were stupid, that they somehow couldn't build these structures themselves, and that is basically not the point. The point is that I don't think you will find anybody who says that the Great Pyramid, well, Zechariah Sitchin did, but apart from him, everybody else will tell you that the Great Pyramid was more than likely built by human hands, but that in its design, in its fabrication technology, the innovations which were done there, that otherworldly intelligences had a hand in that. And it's important to underline that our ancestors themselves, Imhotep, who was instrumental in creating the Pyramid Age, basically said that the gods helped him. So, what is ingenious and what is disingenuous? The fact that an ancient alien person says our ancestors absolutely believed and said that, they walked the path of civilization with the help of the gods, or the attitude of modern science, which basically is that our ancestors were stupid because there's no such thing as gods, and therefore that when they said that they walked the path of civilization, that's just straightforwardly untrue. And they have uncovered the fact that they did all of these things themselves, and that is just in my opinion the real disservice which they do to these people, because they're basically saying that these cultures are indeed stupid and that we should not at all believe what they are saying about their own history. And that is a basic fact. Archaeology quite often begins by saying that everything a culture has handed down through folklore for sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of years is all false. And when people start doing real research into folklore, they will quite often find that actually it's the other way around. That if an archaeologist says that folklore somehow is incompatible or incorrect with the archaeological findings, well, guess what? That archaeologist has probably been doing his job rather poorly.
One thing that you brought up in your book, and going back to when you mentioned primitive cultures not having the wheel, but it's quite possible they had other technologies. Modern science seems to want to think very literally. I can't talk tonight. But, going from discovering fire to the wheel to carts and domesticating animals and blah, blah, blah. But there could have been other technologies that maybe were learned or were taught to us before these inventions. Now, you had mentioned, and I had heard this story before about the gentleman in Florida who had built Coral Castle. Now, for people who aren't aware of that, Coral Castle was a home that was built by this gentleman back in, I believe it was in the 1930s, or you can correct me on that one, where he built this huge structure completely out of coral. Now, coral is one of the hardest rocks to try to cut to begin with, so that was difficult. But not only these massive blocks that weighed tons, and he did it all by himself. And he would never let anybody see what he was doing, but yet they... I supposedly some kids spied on him one day and saw the blocks actually moving themselves. And he had claimed that he had learned the secret that the Egyptians had on how they built the pyramids. So it could quite possibly be a different form of either, I hate saying the word, anti-gravity, or a way of manipulating gravitational fields to move large stones very easily, like an astronaut in space can move a 10-ton satellite just by shifting it because of the weightlessness.
Well, we one of the greatest geniuses which has ever lived, I think, is Nikola Tesla, and he and so many other of those pioneers had an understanding of things like electricity and all of these things, which we will never, I think, easily recover. And one of the early explorers of electricity once went on the record, and I've actually forgotten who it was, but he basically said that he was absolutely convinced that electricity as such had an intelligence, that it was an intelligent force, but that he basically got stopped from looking into that or exploring electricity further because, it's hard to put a percentage on here, but let's say that the world was only interested in 5% of what electricity could offer us, because that was what was required from our understanding of electricity to make electricity come out of a wall into a socket and fire up everything which we wanted to run on electricity. But that electricity was far more complex, far more interesting than what we were using it for. But that economical and industrial pressures basically meant that it never was explored. And in the case of Leeds Scallon, I think he had an understanding, whether it was self-acquired or handed down to him, of basically how the universe worked and how the laws worked. Today, time, we have no idea what time really is. We think it is a side aspect of gravity, and that is something which we're accepting, but there is no real evidence for this, and there are diverging opinions about that, and people who are taking it into different directions. So we don't really know how this universe works. But guess what? Quantum physics was introduced in the 1930s as a real answer to things. And the basic premise of quantum physics is that thought influences the outcome and basically helps create the universe as a whole. And guess what? That means that thinking has got a very central importance in this universe as a creative force. It is why the ancient Egyptians quite often said that the gods thought about it, they imagined it, and then it came about. And so many ancient cultures really express this notion that thinking is really the greatest creative force there is. And so it seems that our ancestors knew something which we only rediscovered in the 1930s. But the interesting thing there is that if you realize that thinking creates or can create physical things, well, that also somehow means that if you're able to think in a certain way, you can do things which otherwise would be not physically impossible, but physically improbable, in the sense that everybody else, whenever they think about that problem, go for a different solution, yet somehow your thinking can change that. And as airy-fairy New Age as that idea might be, what I'm just saying there, it is precisely the premise of quantum physics and basically the premise on which this universe is built. And so that leads Karrie-Ann and so many other people realized this and lived in that tradition, whether that was handed down to them across millennia or whether they figured it out themselves, or whether they found out through some contact with a non-human intelligence, as we know also happened, in the past or in the present. All of those things basically tell us that we are still learning and still really coming only face to face with some of the bigger questions in life, and that we need to do something about it if we really want to find the answers to them.
Philip, what do you consider at this point in all the research that you've personally done, what do you think is one of the most compelling locations that seem to indicate either whether we're dealing with an advanced human or non-human culture on this planet?
Well, Pumapunku would definitely be amongst them. There's an entire chapter, number 6, if I'm not mistaken, devoted to it in my book. There are various incidents which I think we should take into consideration as well. There are some sites across the world where there might be a high level of radioactivity coming from ancient civilizations which were there. Definitely places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, we find people lying in the streets holding hands. Whatever happened there was instantaneous death on a wide scale. And that is something which I think we also need to look at. But what my book I think really shows is that the best evidence, and there is some really solid evidence to suggest that we have been visited and by aliens, but that it is really reaching a stage where we need to have the engagement of science. And one of the cases is Bayan Karaula, where there is this dwarf-like tribe which has puzzled Chinese scientists, and there are two ways of going about this. It's mounting an expedition and going to these people and saying, can I have a bit of your DNA because we want to have some DNA analysis done, which by default would include laboratories and would by default include questions like, can you check for anomalies within this DNA, which seem to be completely weird. But guess what? If you go if say an ancient alien kind of organization an ancient alien theorist kind of like organization would be able to mount this expedition. At one point, when you go into China, you have to fill in the paperwork as to why you're going to go to these people, and you either lie about it and say, oh, it's just some experiment for whatever, or you're truthful. And if you are truthful, then you say, well, because we're looking for an alien marker in their DNA, then probably what the Chinese government is going to do is say, no. If you lie about it, you probably come back with, potential evidence that these beings or these people are indeed of a mixed man-alien stock. And then guess what? The very first thing that the scientist will say is, well, they lied on the application, so we can just completely, eliminate this material. And that is a serious problem, because it is the scientific attitude which is stopping things from being answered. And of course, this is not some kind of accident. This is by design. Scientists do not want to hear about these things. Even the one person who has been trying to say that we might have been visited by extraterrestrial beings in the past is recently went on record, and he basically said that whereas he was quite convinced that we had been visited by extraterrestrials in the past, he absolutely was completely unconvinced that this happened within the period of human habitation on this planet, and instead that it probably happened hundreds of millions of years ago. Well, guess what? We have evidence from across the world, from all civilizations, saying that they had contact with non-human intelligences. So, a scientist who pretends that there is no evidence, or that he thinks that, there is nothing to go on, that we have not been contacted within the human habitation of this planet. I'm kind of wondering, on what planet was he? did he never read anything from history books? Did he never get exposed to any of those things? And if he wasn't, then clearly our scientists have become so specialized that they've basically become useless.
What is your we're talking a lot about ancient aliens or ancient contact with mankind. Do you feel that we are experiencing contact today?
Yes, I mean, contact with non-human intelligence is happening on a daily basis worldwide, whether they are the shamans in the Amazonian rainforests or people using other techniques anywhere else. It is clear that, whereas in medieval times you would have such a thing as like fairy abductions or encounters with fairies, that these things are still going on. I think a large part of the UFO phenomenon is not extraterrestrial in the sense of like some alien race coming here and doing genetic experiments with us, but I do believe that what is happening is real, but of a nature which we really are not yet getting. But contact with non-human intelligences, happens on this planet on a daily occurrence. And, everybody who dies, which is several million each day, go on a voyage whereby they will, find first-hand proof of the fact that there is a reality larger than the ones that we see with our very eyes. Yet somehow we live within a world which doesn't really seem to appreciate all of these things going on, and instead pretends that the Kardashians are far more interesting than these things.
Oh, or Jersey Shore, God help us. Well, then let me ask you this. Have you ever seen a UFO yourself?
I have not seen a UFO myself. I have had one anomalous experience, which was when I was 12 and my grandfather was dying. And at the moment of his death, I basically had a dream whereby I realized he was dying. This was unexpected, and specifically, I floated into the place where he was, and he basically had a very big cabinet. One side was my grandmother's, the other one was his, and the door of his side of that cabinet swung open, and inside there was a watch which wasn't his, and it stopped at 6:37 in the morning. And the very next thing was that I got woken up by the doorbell ringing, and my alarm clock said it was 6:53. And basically, over the rest of that day, first of all, I was told that my grandfather had died over lunchtime, and I already knew that had happened because of what I had experienced. And then at night when we went to, or in the evening when we went to my grandmother, and various people came to give their condolences, she began to relate what had happened. And guess what? He died between 6:35 and 6:40.
Wow. Now, I know we've had ourselves, because we are paranormal investigators, and we do mainly ghost hunting or paranormal research. So we've had experiences like that as well. Although I've never seen a UFO, although I keep looking up for one. I believe something is happening. Karrie-Ann, I think you're a little more skeptical, though.
I'm very skeptical.
You don't believe in Bigfoot either.
Well, but I don't believe in a lot of things until I see it with my own eyes, because, as you know, I've become such a wizard on photoshopping. I can make anything look legitimate. So.
And that is the other problem with the digital age that we live in. It's so hard to present evidence that people will believe in, even from artifacts from the past, because people are so used to hoaxes and fakes propping up online on YouTube and Facebook. And Philip, do you think that we'll ever, as a society, within our lifetimes, accept the fact that there are intelligences elsewhere?
If we want to, yes. I this is like where I end in the book, which is like, how much evidence do you want? Where do you put, the level of what constitutes evidence? There is sufficient evidence out there which shows that our ancestors absolutely believed that we were not alone, that they walked the path of civilization with another intelligence. Now you can can say that our ancestors were stupid, or you can pretend that our ancestors didn't say that, which is the attitude science is taking. But at least I think we need to come to a position that and agree that our ancestors were saying that. And then what is the burden of proof? There's a story in the book which is basically that because Ancient Aliens is a popular TV show, students watched this and they asked their professor, and the professor was asked some questions, and at one point the professor said, well, we know that this didn't happen, and the student said, well, but how do you know? And the professor said, we know, okay. It's not a very scientific attitude, but it shows that he tried to put the burden of proof a bit to kind of like, too loose or too high or whatever you want to do it. We need to decide what, is an acceptable level of proof. And I think that once we have determined that, then I think at least we can, come to an understanding that reality is larger, and far more, comprehensive than what we quite often make it into. And I think that is something which we truly need to accept for, the benefit of ourselves as a species and as a civilization, and the way we treat each other. And once we have done that, I think, the rest will go a bit easier. And I do hope that this is going to go fast, because since a few years we are a global village. We have this wonderful technology at our disposal, whereby we can, anybody for roughly a month's salary can fly around the world in less than 48 hours. That is absolutely phenomenal. We can phone to people in the Amazon and have a great connection, which 15 years ago would simply have been impossible. So many great things which we can do, which underlines that we are a global village. But at the same time, we have politicians who are, trying to build walls between Arizona and Mexico, or are trying to come up with immigration policies for Europe, or are trying to, try to create borders where none were there before, because somehow these people somehow feel that there are votes to be won from sections of the population by doing these crazy things which are completely ridiculous, which have no chance of success, because it's addressing an issue which isn't even real, and isn't accepting the fact that we are a global village. Our phone calls get answered in India, and our furniture and everything else is made in China. It is a global economy, and we need to start thinking on a global level, and we need to start treating these people who make these things for us, as well as the people from Africa who continuously seem to be forgotten, part and parcel of this global village, and treat them as being on par, and listening to them, and bringing them into the debate, rather than continuously trying to dominate, and trying to maintain a status quo, which is so post 1990 that it almost beggars belief. The world of 1993 and the world of 2013 are completely different, and it is time for certain sections of the world, specifically politicians and other people, to really accept that and embrace that. And I think when that happens, the world will be a better place.
Well, when you mentioned time flying, I hate to say it, our time has really flown tonight. Philip, thank you very much for coming on our show tonight. Now, your new book is called The Ancient Alien Question. Where can people find that?
They can find it anywhere. Amazon is obviously a good place to start. Barnes & Noble, or whatever your local bookstore is. Barnes & Noble is online. But basically anywhere where books are sold, this book should be found, and will be found.
And if anybody wants to get... Go ahead, Karrie-Ann.
Yeah, before we leave him, because I want to commend him on an awesome website. I know I will be perusing it for months to come. If anyone wants to go, you have the most awesome articles. I love how you've done it by country, and even also on down at the bottom on just general interest. And I really wanted to touch on the crystal skulls so badly, but we'll have to do that another time. But I absolutely just love your website. I mean, you have gone everywhere. You have seen every anomaly of civilization out there. It's just amazing.
Well, thank you. And if anybody wants to explore that, it's philipcoppens.com, which is PHILIPCOPPENS. And if you type my name into Twitter or Facebook, you will come to my Twitter and or Facebook feeds as well.
Yeah, it's a great website.
It is. And Philip, thank you very much for coming on with us tonight. We loved having you on. We're going to have to bring you back again.
It's been my pleasure, and it'll be a pleasure to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
And that does it for this edition of Unknown Origins Radio. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we're going to sign off with our motivational quote of the week.
Oh, no.
Two's company, three's a sandwich.
Oh my God. Please sandwich.
Have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah.